Pastamai, ladies and gentlemen, Felcheriu, Dusan Taitasti Vanin. Welcome to the Manx Museum. My name's Edmund Southworth. I'm the director of Manx National Heritage, but I've got another role, which is a very pleasant one. I'm the chairman of something called the Destination Viking Association. And there are two members of this organisation on the Isle of Man. One's ourselves, and the other is Vikings of Man, who, as you may have gathered, have added a particular piquancy to the evening. What you can smell is wood smoke. And they've been unable to invent showers yet. And they warmly welcome you if you are able to visit them at Tynwald, where they are camping out, but in a remarkably authentic and helpful and useful addition to the Manx offer. The Destination Viking Association has also the privilege of managing the Viking route of European cultural heritage. And this is actually certified by the Council of Europe as one of 38 cultural routes across Europe. You will be familiar with the Santiago de Compostela pilgrim route, which is one of the first. You might not be as familiar with the St. Olaf's Way, which is 600 kilometres of hard hiking across Norway. Doesn't appeal to me, but for some people. But the Isle of Man is very clearly part of the Viking route of cultural heritage across Europe. And that is really what we're here to hear about tonight. And as our speaker will explain, there is a looseness of term between Viking and Norse. I'm sure that will come up. But as a brand, Viking is far more powerful than Norse, so that's what we use. Professor McDonald is no stranger to the Isle of Man, and we're particularly delighted that he's been able to bring his family with him to enjoy the sunshine and in the island where it never rains or snows or gets foggy or anything like that. Professor McDonald, as I say, is no stranger to the Isle of Man, and he's one of those rare people, a distinguished academic who has focused on a period which is complex to understand, but he has made it intelligible to far more people than ever before. He has an understanding of the different sources, and one of the things we understand about the Isle of Man is that to understand it, you have to understand the Gaelic tradition, you have to understand the history of Scotland, you have to understand the relationship with Norway, and you have to be familiar with original sources in various languages. And in his position as lecturer in history and head of Centre for Medieval and Renaissance Studies at Brock University, he's uniquely positioned to that. He's very kindly, in his new book, referred to the work we've been doing in Manx National Heritage. What he hasn't put in there is the fact that he's helped us with it. And colleagues have found him always willing to answer an email, to check a fact, to pick up a reference, and we are grateful for your help as an academic colleague over the years. Without further ado, you're going to address us on this amazing topic, In Search of the Sea Kings. Professor McDonald.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for that, Edmund, and thank you, everyone, for coming out this evening on the eve of Tynwald Day. I know if we tried to pull off something like this in Canada on the eve of Canada Day, it would be me and an audience of crickets chirping. So this is really fantastic. Thank you. Before I do anything else, just would like to acknowledge quickly this would not have been possible without the hard work and efforts of a couple of different groups. First of all, the good folks at John Donald and Berlin Publishers in Edinburgh, who have published the book and worked closely with people here to make sure that it's here, and they've done a great job. And secondly, thanks to all the good folks at Manx National Heritage for their role on this end, especially Alison Fox, who is a point person. I've worked closely with her. So thanks to them. And without further ado, really pleased to be able to speak a little bit about the book, which is called The Sea Kings, the Late Norse Kingdoms of Man and the Isles, circa 1066 to 1275. And I thought what I might do briefly before I really get into the talk is just sort of explain a little bit about how this book sort of came to be and what it aims to do. It covers a period of history that is, I think, becoming less neglected, but is still probably a neglected period in the history of the British Isles as a whole. One can go and pick up any number of recent studies of the medieval British Isles published even in the last 10 years, and one still really struggles to find very much on man and the Isles in those works. About 15 years ago, I set out on a research project that I thought would produce something like this. And in 2007, I published a book that was called Manx Kingship in its Irish Sea Setting. It was principally about one of the Manx kings, King Ragnhild Godson. It actually started off life. I intended to write this book as sort of a history of the whole period and the whole dynasty. And as I started writing that book, it somehow became more focused on the reign of King Ragnhild. It turned into that book, and then other things came along. And about 5 years ago, I was able to finally get back to this and come back to the whole wonderful history of this forgotten kingdom, as I call it. And I think it is still fair to call it a forgotten kingdom. It's, I think, less forgotten than it was 25 years ago, but I still think it's something we need to continue to investigate. And so this book is really the result of that. Now, I was somewhat mortified when I saw how thick the book is. And so thinking about what can I say in 35 or 40 minutes tonight, you'd be glad to know there's no test before you're allowed to leave the door. So I thought what I would do is two things. Spend a few minutes giving you sort of a brief overview of the dynasties, the kings, the region involved. I probably need to do that less here than I do anywhere else in the world, so it's wonderful because you're very well acquainted with your Manx Sea Kings and, of course, with the Isles, but I think it's useful just as a bit of context. And then I thought what I will do is I just want to dig into 2 or 3 aspects of this that I hope you will find interesting, that I can relate to a little bit sort of larger context for you, and we'll see where we are at that point. So I hope that this is a sort of a useful little sort of preview of what's in the book and a little introduction. And I also hope that maybe it leaves you wanting a little bit more and you can dig into the book at some point. So here we go. If I was making this into a film, I would probably start at the end. So I thought I'll be dramatic and we'll start at the end. I hear there's a new musical down in London about the 6 wives of Henry VIII called Six. So then I thought maybe we should make this into a musical too of the Sea Kings. So anyway, if we want to be dramatic and think about these things, but I would start at near the end of the story with the entry in the Manx Chronicle, which tells us that in the year 1265, on the 24th of November, Magnus, son of Olaf, king of Man in the Isles, died at Castle Rushen and was buried in St. Mary's Abbey, Rushen. And then it moves on and tells us that in the next year, control of the Isle of Man passed to Scotland. And this, as T.S. Eliot writes, sort of is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper, barely a comment in the Manx Chronicle. But across the Irish Sea at the monastery of Furness in Cumbria, there was a set of annals produced that noted this same event, but added the significant little comment afterwards, just a few Latin words, and kings ceased to reign in man, the annals said. And that catches the significance of this event, the death of Magnus, of course famous as the last Manx king at Russian, the end of the dynasty, the end of an era. And then, of course, we move into a very turbulent period characterized by the wars between England and Scotland, the Isle of Man, and strategic situation passed back and forth between England and Scotland. So this sort of the end of, I don't know if we want to think of it as a golden age, but it's certainly the end of an era. Now, once again, probably one of the few places where I don't have to say very much about this text, the Manx Chronicle, or the Chronicles of the Kings of Man in the Isles, which of course is so well known here, but not as well known as it ought to be just about anywhere else, at least outside very small academic circles. So I thought what I might do is just set the stage a little bit with a few comments about this, because I will come back to this, and I do have comments that are sort of grounded in the Chronicles and in understanding a few things about the Chronicles. 13th century text, of course, probably composed here on the island at Rushen Abbey, probably begun in the 1250s, covering the period from the early part of the 11th century through to the early part of the 14th century. The thing that's important about that is that much of the Chronicle was therefore composed sort of retroactively, looking by people in the mid-13th century, sort of looking back, who may have had access to various types of documents and various records. And if you've read the Chronicle, and I know many of you have, one of the things that will strike you is that as you progress through the Chronicle's pages, things get more detailed as you get into the 12th and the 13th century entries. The chronology improves and you get more details. So this is a very, very important source. This is a principal source that, as I put it in the book, I've sort of described this as the key to unlocking the history of the period. But we have to use it in conjunction with many other types of sources. So one can work with English records, Scottish records, Irish texts, even Icelandic saga texts come into play. And I liken the process of sort of searching for the sea kings as a lot of sort of detective work involved, trying to match up things that are in the Chronicle with other sources. Sometimes we can do that. Sometimes we have things that the Chronicle doesn't tell us that we find in other sources. So it's very interesting to play detective and to sort of work with all of these texts and try to put the pieces together. At the end of the day, there's a lot that we don't know and that we can't know, but also at the end of the day, it's really quite remarkable what it's possible to do using sort of all of these different types of evidence. Just to give you one example. King Ragnhild Godson, who died in 1229, one of the most powerful, longest reigning of these kings, kind of one of my favorites. He made a number of journeys to England, the early part of the 13th century, and he engaged in diplomatic relations with King John of England. The Chronicle says nothing of that, but there's a very interesting trail of English government and official documents that record these visits, safe conducts, and various other types of documents. And that's just one example of the way that you can mesh these things together. Of course, it makes you scratch your head and wonder, why doesn't the Chronicle mention these things? Well, that's why I don't have very much hair left, and that's a question for another day. So I think from there I best move on. So part one here I call sort of meet the Sea Kings, and I won't spend a long time on this because I think most of these names will be very familiar to you. So I present Exhibit A, which is a very simplified table of the principally the Manx dynasty, but also I include over on the right-hand side here the Hebridean line of kings descended from Somerled of Argyll. You're probably familiar with this. You're familiar with most of these kings, but I thought what I might do is just say a few things. I've used these images of the famous Lewis chessmen to represent them. And these things are, of course, icons of the Viking Age, but they actually, as I'm sure you know, really belong to the period that we're talking about tonight. They date from the 12th century, so they fit nicely chronologically into the sort of period of the kingdom. They were discovered in the Isle of Lewis, as you know, in the 1830s. But what I think probably should be better known about them is the fact that at that time, there's good evidence that Lewis was under the sway of the Manx kings. And so there might be a Manx connection for these chess pieces that we sort of think of as Scottish. We think of them as, but of course, made in either Norway or Iceland. And we don't know the circumstances of deposition in Lewis. So my Lewis chessmen icon. So the dynasty, as you can see, spanning almost 200 years. There's almost 2 centuries of history here, from Goddard Kravan, the famous founder of the dynasty, who died in 1095, famous, of course, for his conquest of the Isle of Man in 1079, and famous also as something of a warlord, said to have conquered Leinster, for whatever that means. Seems to have had a reputation as being quite a formidable warlord, and famous, of course, as the founder of both of these dynasties of sea kings, because they both looked back to him as being the what you might think of as the sort of apical figure of both dynasties. After his death in 1095, we get into a period of some turbulence in the region when various elements are competing for power, not just Manx and Irish, but also Norwegian. And there's quite a turbulent period of some 15 or 20 years that is quite murky and quite difficult to disentangle until we come to his son Olaf, who seems to take the kingship in about 1113, has a very long reign down till 1153. And he is probably equally famous on a sort of a par with Goddard Kravan as almost being a second founder of the kingdom, because it really seems to be Olaf who really consolidates whatever Goddard Kravan had put together, and then consolidates it into something that starts to look like a very stable kingdom on more or less contemporary sort of European lines. Now, it's at this point, of course, that we get the circumstances that lead to the creation of a whole second dynasty and a whole second kingdom of the Isles. So one of Olaf's daughters, by a concubine named Ragnhild, had married this up-and-comer from the west of Scotland, Somerled of Argyll, and this leads to the sort of fragmentation of the kingdom in the middle of the 12th century, which I will come back to. So we have then, following Olaf, we have Godred, who died in 1187. He's an interesting figure with a mixed sort of reputation, because on the one hand, he seems to have undertaken some military endeavors in Ireland. He seems to have been something of a formidable warrior. Certainly, he was the king in the Isle of Man at the time the English invasion of Ireland was taking place, and he actually lent some military support to the Irish against the English as they sought to take Dublin. But it was also in his reign that Somerled managed to wrest part of the kingdom out of his grasp, and he was actually driven out of Man for a period of time, and spent some time in England and Scotland and Norway. So Godred has sort of a mixed reputation. And then in the next generation, his two sons, Olaf and Ragnhild, famous for the animosity and the massive feud between them, which I'll come back to in a moment. But here is King Ragnhild Godredson, whom I've mentioned, probably one of the most powerful of these kings, certainly in terms of his international reputation. This was a man whose reputation stretched from Iceland to Rome. He's mentioned in Icelandic sagas as being a great warrior. He corresponded with the papacy. He had diplomatic dealings with the English kings. So he was a figure of some stature. And I have to say, just as an aside, if you've been down to Castle Rushen and you've been through and you've seen the lovely representation of King Ragnhild there looking very sort of superhero Avenger-ish, exactly as I imagine him. So well done, Alison and co on that. And then, of course, we have the sort of the last generation. In a way, a couple of tragedies here. Olaf's son, Harald, who is drowned in a shipwreck off Shetland in the year 1248, which leads to some instability. He is succeeded the next year very, very briefly by by his brother Ragnhild, about whom we know virtually nothing except that he was murdered in 1249 after a reign of about 3 weeks. And then we come to Magnus, the last king. Now, just to go over to the right side of the chart here and come back to Somerled of Argyll, I've simplified this tremendously in the interests of clarity. So if you're a fan of the descendants of Somerled, I do apologize for simplifying this tremendously. But of course, Somerled is famous in his own right as the founder of several very, very significant West Highland families and a dynasty of sea kings who rule in the West Highlands and Islands of Scotland down until the 1260s, and then whose importance continues on beyond that, and eventually one of those branches sort of reemerges as the Lords of the Isles in the 14th century, collectively known as the MacSorleys, the clan Somerl, the descendants of Somerled, several branches there. So this is essentially these are the dynasties that I'm concerned with, and these are some of the key figures, although it's a lot more complicated than that. One of the ways that it's more complicated is because this all looks very nice and tidy, and it looks like there's a very nice orderly succession and everything flows very smoothly. Well, I've already given you some hints that the poor Ragnhild here is murdered. And one of the challenges, that the dynasties, both dynasties had to try to deal with was internal strife and internal factionalism at times of crisis, and particularly on the death of one king and the succession of another one. And so when you study these dynasties and you sort of look at the history of these dynasties, one of the things that you're constantly struck by is how much infighting there is within these families. And this manifests itself, the death of Goddard Kravan, there's civil strife. Two of his sons, Lagman and Harald, are feuding, and Lagman is said to have killed his brother Harald. A nice illustration from a manuscript of Gerald of Wales. Some of you may know the text, the History and Topography of Ireland. Gerald wrote quite a bit about the Irish, and one of the things he noted about the Irish was this propensity for feuding and kin feuding. So a nice Irish kin feud there. This manifests itself after the death of Olaf. It manifests itself famously in the feud that spans some 30 years between Olaf and Ragnhild. It manifests itself in the reign of Olaf. It manifests itself in the reign of Ragnhild, even though we don't really know too much about the circumstances of this. And even as late as the early 1250s, we're told that there was still this threat of internal dissent in the reign of Magnus. So literally, this factionalism spans the entire dynasty. And it's also a characteristic of the descendants of Somerled. I think in the interest of time, I'll probably not spend very long on this slide because I want to make sure I get on to some of my other things that you'll find interesting. But I think people are probably familiar with the extent of these insular kingdoms. But I would just point out if we're interested in the split between the Manx dynasty and the descendants of Somerled, that's one of the things that I've tried to illustrate here. The rise of Somerled in the 1150s and then the eventual split in the 1160s meant that this sort of central island group, principally the Mull and the Isla groups of islands, was taken out of the control of the Manx dynasty and fell under the control of Somerled and his descendants. Now that left, of course, the Manx kings still seemingly controlling the Isle of Skye and some or all of the Outer Hebrides. It's very difficult to sort out the delineations of these things. But the thing that I find very interesting about this, as I mentioned earlier, there's good evidence for Manx presence and Manx control in the Outer Hebrides in Lewis and Harris. And so the achievement of these kings in continuing to rule a realm that essentially had been fragmented and had this significant sort of chunk taken out of the center out of it, I think is quite remarkable. And it reminds us about, of course, the fact that we're talking about sea-girt kingdoms, archipelagic kingdoms, and control of the seas is what really matters here. And that's how you hold these things together. That's how Somerled and his descendants did it as well. So, on to part two, and with a little bit of a brief overview in our pockets, and I hope I haven't bored you too much, I'd just like to zoom in and highlight a few aspects of this that I hope you'll find interesting and significant, and just make a few points. And I think there are a few common themes here that may emerge from this. Sometimes when I teach an upper year seminar at my university, I get my students to read the Chronicles. Lucky students, I know. I always tell them they're joining a very exclusive club. And often one of the comments that is made when I ask them, so what did you think? They say, wow. They talk about the fact that they see these kings as Vikings, and they see them as sort of Viking kings. And the idea that we talk about these sea kings as being Norse or Viking, and say, okay, why do you think that? And they comment on two things. They comment on the names, which are, of course, many of them very Scandinavian sounding, but they comment on their behavior. So they act like Vikings. They're raiding, they're pillaging. Look at the Manx Chronicle. Goddard Kravan conquers the Isle of Man. What does he tell his soldiers? He gives them the choice of, plunder and go home or stay and settle. And a lot of them choose the plunder option. You look at Somerled coming into the Isle of Man in the late 1150s and plundering. And it takes a miracle of St. Macwold, St. Macutus, to chase Somerled off with supernatural intervention. So there is the tendency to think about these kings as sort of Viking kings. And it extends out with the pages of the Chronicle in Orkneyinga Saga, the saga of the Orkney Islanders, which is interestingly written more or less about the same time as the Chronicles. Near the end of that text, King Ragnhild Godson makes an appearance, and he makes an appearance as a strong man helping out the Scottish king in his conflict with the Earl of Orkney. And in Orkneyinga Saga, the saga man describes King Ragnhild as the greatest warrior in all the Western lands. And that's a text that was written in Iceland, early 13th century, and that was the sort of reputation that King Ragnhild had. King Ragnhild had a praise poem in Irish that was composed for him sometime early on in his reign. And as with many praise poems, when you read these things, the ruler is presented as a great warrior. He's presented striking down his enemies. His fleet of ships is described. He's a fantastic warrior. So again, that sort of promoting that image, that idea of the Vikings. And that extends to also the descendants of Somerled They had praise poems that were composed in their honor, and the praise poems sort of celebrate the same virtues, the same martial virtues. One of the things that I find very interesting looking across all of the source material is thinking about the military resources that these kings commanded. And I've done a lot of work comparing all of the different sources and looking at the size of the fleets that these rulers are said to have commanded, sometimes upwards of 100 vessels. That may not sound like a lot in modern terms, but that's a very substantial medieval fleet. And so they were real military strongmen. They had a lot of muscle to throw around. They weren't military lightweights. They weren't kings of summer. They were real military strongmen who controlled a strategic location in the middle of the Irish Sea. The fleets were sometimes available for hire. We know they could be hired out on a mercenary basis, and they were. And probably the most striking aspect of their military strength, and I think just to boil it down to one example, in 1235 the English king actually engaged King Olaf of Man to undertake Coast Guard duties and hired the Manx fleet to patrol the Irish Sea to keep piracy down. The English were concerned, of course, about control of the sea routes between England and Ireland. And you think that's a little bit ironic given that King Ragnhild was celebrated as a great sort of raider and a great pirate. And here the English king is hiring King Olaf to keep a lid on piracy. So on the one hand, Viking-looking kings. But if you dig a little deeper and look a little harder, there's a whole different side to these kings. And one of the themes that I think emerges, and one of the ideas that I play with a little bit in the book, is the idea of sort of double-sided appearances. On the one hand, yes, Viking kings, great strong men, great warlords, commanding substantial military resources. But on the other hand, for some, the term Viking connotes paganism. And of course, these kings are not pagans. They've been Christian right from the beginning. Goddard Kravan is a Christian, never mind his decision to let his army plunder the island. The dynasty is Christian. And from the very next generation after Goddard Kravan, not only that, but they prove themselves to be Christians in a very up-to-date, contemporary mode. Now, what I mean by that is, in the 11th and 12th century, there was something akin to a sort of a series of revolutions going on within medieval Christianity. There were new religious orders that were coming into being, like the Augustinians and the Cistercians. Cistercians are quite well known. The papacy was developing the structure of what's sometimes described as a papal monarchy. It was extending its reach. So there were tremendous changes going on in this period as far as Christianity goes. And these rulers in the Isle of Man and in the Hebrides, the descendants of Somerled, you know, one way of looking at these places is to see them as being out on the margins of Atlantic Europe and see them as being remote and distant from, you know, the continent and these sorts of places. And in fact, they were very much in tune with contemporary developments in Christianity. Of course, King Olaf, the son of Goddard Kravan, founds Rushen Abbey. We know that. See Peter Davy there, a man who's excavated the site. So that's a great example of the way in which these kings are very much in tune with these trends. And it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop at Rushen Abbey. The Manx kings are patrons of monasteries in Ireland and in England and in Scotland, and they act as benefactors, and they make grants of land, and they extend their patronage around the shores of the Irish Sea. The descendants of Somerled do the same thing. And in doing this, of course, they're engaging with these contemporary trends, and they're showing themselves to be very sort of up-to-date, modern, I want to say cutting-edge types of of monarchs. They're fully in tune with these developments, and their contemporaries in Scotland and some of the Welsh princes are doing the same things. But in fact, I think it's worth pointing out that the foundation of Rushen Abbey in 1134 is a couple of years ahead of the foundation of the first Cistercian monastery in Scotland, which is Melrose in 1136. So it's just worth keeping these things in mind. And I think at the end of the day, what we see here is this sort of, it's not, I've deliberately put this opposition, Viking pirates or Christian princes. It's not one or the other. It's both. It's Viking pirates and Christian princes. And I think to a certain extent it depends a little bit on who are we talking to, who are we playing to here, what types of sources are we looking at. A Gaelic praise poem. A praise poem is dictated by sort of particular rules and literary themes that are expected to be there, so that one of the things that these poems play up is the martial virtue of the rulers, whereas a letter to the Pope is an entirely different matter. So it depends a little bit on the type of sources we're talking about. In a related note, and just to kind of build on this idea of being in touch with contemporary trends, let's move a little bit beyond the religious sphere and let's just think about the secular sphere as well. Knights and knighthood in Man in the Isles. Now, we're so used to thinking of these kings as sort of Viking kings and as roving, maritime chieftains. It's worth pausing for a moment just to consider the fact that many of these individuals are either knighted, knights, or have some familiarity, and probably more than just a passing sort of familiarity with knighthood. A couple of examples from the Manx Chronicle. The last two kings of the Manx dynasty, King Magnus and King Harald, both had traveled to England and had been knighted by King Henry III in 1256 and 1247, respectively. And the Chronicle makes the interesting little comment that they returned home with many gifts and with their reputations sort of enhanced. We think, wow, so we've got sort of Viking sea kings that are also knights. At about the same time, we have documentation that one of the major members of the MacDougall family, the descendants of Somerled, was also a knight. Ewan of Argyll, the Lord of Argyll, described by an English chronicler as a vigorous knight. If we go back a little further into the history of the dynasty, we can see evidence that these figures are familiar with knighthood. We don't necessarily have direct references that they were in fact knighted. But to give you one example, King Ragnhild of Man is said to have had a seal, which had a knight on one side and a galley on the other. Now, having a knight on your seal doesn't necessarily mean that you were knighted. It could, doesn't necessarily, and we don't have a reference to him being knighted specifically. But it's interesting that it suggests, okay, he wants to present himself in this way. He wants to show that he's very much in touch with these trends. And I think it's fantastic to think about the double-sided nature of the seal, with the galley on one side, the kind of traditional symbol of the sea kings, of Viking power, and on the other side, the image of the knight. Now, of course, knighthood and all of its trappings come from the continent ultimately. It come to England in the wake of the Norman conquest, and then they sort of spread through the British Isles. So there's a sense in which by engaging with this sort of culture of knighthood, these kings are also demonstrating, look, we're thoroughly up to date, we're contemporary, we're kind of hip and happening, and we're with it, and we're part of this contemporary international culture that spans Europe. And I lie awake at night and you think, what was it like for Magnus to go to England and be knighted by Henry III and what was going through his mind and what were these gifts that he received. And then think about how that's going to increase his sort of stature as he heads back home, you know, decked out with all of these goodies and laden with all of these exotic gifts, and how that's going to enhance his status and his reputation and his prestige. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about here. And the last point, I think I'm more or less, how am I doing, timekeeper? Am I okay? I think I'm more or less on time. Okay, thank you. My lovely assistant, so timekeeper here. So one of the things that you're probably thinking is to say, wow, this is all very about men and very male-dominated, and what about women and gender and power and women's roles? And so I'll just say a couple of things about this. This is something that as I've written the book, I've gotten more and more interested in, because I've come to think about the Chronicle in a particular way, and I have come to sort of start thinking about the fact that even though there's not a lot of explicit information and explicit evidence for women in this period in the kingdoms of Man and the Isles, there's a lot that's buried in the Chronicle that we can tease out if we are willing to really dig and think about it in a particular way. So in a nutshell, let me just say a couple of things. Of course, the period we're talking about, it's a male-dominated world. Attitudes towards women are very different from sort of modern attitudes. Outright misogyny is very common. So on one hand, when you go through the Chronicle and you sort of look for women, we need to bear these things in mind. You go through the Chronicle and you look for women, and there's a handful of women that are mentioned by name. There's 5. One of them is Manx, only one. Africa, who is the daughter of King Goddard Olafson, and she is principally famous for marrying John de Courcy, who was the conqueror of Ulster in the north of Ireland. And we don't know when the marriage occurred, but sometime probably not too long after John de Courcy's initial conquest in the late 1170s, she was married to John de Courcy. There's a brief mention of her in the Chronicle. There's a brief mention of the marriage. It's mentioned in other sources. And then she pretty much sort of disappears from the sort of annals of history. Interestingly, she outlived him considerably. She was still alive as late as 1219. And John de Courcy himself, long since dead by then. So there's this very interesting case of a sort of a Manx princess marrying Anglo-Norman English conqueror of Ulster and living in the north of Ireland, maintaining some connections, I think, with the Isle of Man. But the other women that are mentioned are all from outside of the Isle of Man. There's another Africa who was a daughter of Fergus of Galloway, who married King Olaf of Man. She is mentioned briefly. And there are a couple of Scottish ladies who marry into the dynasty in the 13th century. But one of the things that I find really interesting about this is 2 points. We see different roles for women in the pages of the Chronicle, and even in these very, very brief little mentions and references. We see them as wives, we see them as mothers, we see them as queens, we see them as concubines. And now here's the second thing that's really interesting when you dig into what the Chronicle has to say and we start thinking about women and marriage and power. It's very clear that one of the things that went on in these dynasties is that these kings had several wives, probably. There's a system of sort of, it's not exactly polygamy, where they would have a principal wife and they would have a series of concubines. So there was sort of a principal wife, but they would also have other women that would have some status as concubines. And they had children by all of these women. Now, two things about this. One, if we go back to the earlier problem of factionalism within the dynasty and all of this feuding that goes on within the dynasty, and we think, why does this happen? One of the reasons that this happens is because sometimes we've got sons by different mothers, and they are jockeying for power and position, and their status may depend to a certain extent on the status of their mothers. So it's very interesting to consider that feuding that goes on within the dynasty in light of some of these marriage practices. Now, the other thing that we can see happening in the pages of the Chronicle is that the church is working, of course, because from the 11th and the 12th century, these are practices that the church does not approve of. The church is working to try and, how shall we say, reform the habits of these kings and convince them that, no, you know what, this is not the way it works. There's one wife, and you don't have concubines, and, you know, notions of illegitimacy become much more prevalent. In 1176, a papal representative actually visits the Isle of Man, and we're told very pointedly in the Chronicle that he gets King Godred to marry and take as his lawful wife an Irish princess who was the daughter of one of the Irish kings. And that is a great example of the way in which the church is sort of working to try and reform these habits that they do not approve of. But the practice of keeping concubines seems to continue into the 13th century. King Olaf, Godson, the brother of King Ragnhild, is said to have kept a concubine, for example. And this also leads us to one of the really interesting little mysteries within the pages of the Chronicle. And I'll just mention this, and then I'll sort of move to wrap up, I think. In describing the feud between King Olaf and King Ragnhild that dominates the reign of King Ragnhild, this sort of 30-year struggle between these brothers, the Chronicle, I should say the compiler of the Chronicle, is very pointed in putting the blame for the start of this feud on the wife of King Ragnhild. And the Chronicle, you may recall, contains this really long discussion in the middle of it about how this feud got started. And it started because King Ragnhild's wife, and she is named as Queen of the Isles, Regina Insularum. It says the Queen of the Isles. Doesn't name her. Sent her son to go and kill Olaf, and the assassination attempt went bad, and this is what sort of sparked this massive feud between Olaf and Ragnhild. And one of the things that has really vexed me over the last few years, in particular as I've gotten into this section of the book, is to think, why doesn't the chronicler name the queen? Bearing in mind that these events are taking place in the 1220s, they're within living memory of the compiler of the Chronicle, if we accept that it was being begun in the 1250s. Bearing in mind that the compiler of the Chronicle knows the names of other women, he knows the name of both of King Olaf's wives, I think it's very unlikely that he didn't know the name. He didn't include the name there because he characterizes her actions as these sort of wicked actions of the queen that sparked this feud that kind of fragmented the dynasty. And it's interesting also, if you go back a little bit further to the marriage of Somerled to Ragnhild, the daughter of King Olaf by a concubine, the Chronicle comments pointedly in describing the marriage. It says that she was the cause of the breakup of the kingdom of the Isles. It wasn't because Somerled came and invaded and chased out Godred. It was because this woman, she was the cause. So I think, to come back to this little sort of mystery, I think it's very instructive to dig into this and to think about the influence that women had in this dynasty. We go back to the role of this unnamed queen of the Isles, clearly very influential, very important, but unnamed because I think the chronicler was sort of holding her responsible for this, and therefore we can sort of think about, okay, so what can we learn about attitudes towards women and gender and power in this period? And we can see simultaneously the attitudes of the church as they come in and try to reform these practices. So the long and short of it is that it's a very interesting period to study precisely because we have, to a certain extent, these apparent sort of contradictions between the different texts. We have these seemingly contradictory images of these rulers, Viking kings or Christian princes, Viking kings and Christian princes. And they're ruling at a time when there's tremendous change going on in European society generally, and they respond to that change. One of the dangers, I think, of sort of looking at this period, and particularly Man and the Western Isles of Scotland, sometimes you get the sense that this is like sort of trapped in a time warp, that things have not changed since the Viking Age, that it's just sort of more of the same: pillage, plunder, repeat as necessary, pillage, plunder, eat, sleep, pillage, repeat. But I don't think that's the case. I think what's really interesting about this period is the way in which we see these rulers responding to these broader tendencies and broader developments in medieval European society, and doing so very effectively and very efficiently. And I think that may be part of the answer to how and why these kingdoms are able to endure successfully for so long, for some 2 centuries. So I think perhaps on that note, I had better wrap up. I won't say anything about that, but I would just like to finish off with a moment, if I could just make a couple of acknowledgements and take the opportunity for a bit of a special thanks to, first of all, the good folks at John Donald and Berlin that I've worked with closely over the last few years in putting this together, especially Mary Sutherland, the academic editor, who's been fantastic, and Lucy Mertkes, who actually helped put this event together, so thanks to them. My colleagues, my goodness. The author's name goes on the spine of the book, but you work with wonderful colleagues, and we communicate, and we present papers at conferences, and we share ideas. And I'm so grateful for the many colleagues that I have worked with, including many good folks here in the Isle of Man. So people like Alison Fox, Andy Johnson, Peter Davey, others like David Caldwell in Scotland, and some of my colleagues at home in North America. One just benefits from these collaborations so tremendously, and I think I could have written the book without the help of these people, but I know it would have been a much poorer effort, so I'm very grateful for that. And again, for all my Manx colleagues who are here, just thank you so much. Various institutions, including Manx National Heritage, National Library of Scotland, all of the institutions that provide access to documents, that provide images for the book, that provide digital images in this wonderful digital age. It's sometimes possible to look at things up close without actually archives having to go and pull them, and they don't like fingers on them sometimes, so that's great. And lastly, since they're here, my family, my support network, couldn't do it without you guys, my wife Jacqueline, my daughter Emma, and my son Colin, and thanks for all of your support. And I think on that note, I will call that a wrap. Say thank you so much, and good evening.